Okay, let's start. Thank you very much. We have two exciting guests today. And Yuki just arrived in Boston. And also Nanako, who's all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. So if you could just introduce yourself, let's start with Nanako and how you end up where you are today, starting from your maybe college days. And so if you could share your story, Nanako.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, it's nice to be part of this video. So my name is Nanako. I'm a Pomona college grad of 2011. So quite a long time ago, actually. This is my 10th year reunion, actually. And so I studied economics back in my undergrad days. Basically, after I left Pomona, I went to go work in a management consulting firm called Oliver Wyman in New York, where I kind of specialize in the financial services industry. When I was in consulting, I started kind of realizing that this wasn't really what I wanted to do in the long term, and essentially kind of had always been interested in international development and kind of going to, the emerging markets and doing something very different. And I was also starting to think about, going to graduate school and kind of longer term career trajectory. So after I spent 2 years in New York in consulting, I actually moved to a very small country in Africa called Swaziland. Right now, they actually changed the name. It's called Eswatini, but it's a small landlocked country between South Africa and Mozambique. And there I worked with a public health organization called the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and mostly working with ministries of health in Swaziland as well, but also kind of across the Southern African region, and basically helping them facilitate HIV and tuberculosis policymaking. And Southern Africa in general has the world's worst HIV tuberculosis rate. So kind of really got to put my hands into deep into international development work, what it felt like to kind of be on the ground in Africa. And basically 2 years there made me totally fall in love with the work. I really liked being in that region, and also figured, this is actually a pretty good time to transition into graduate school. And when I was working with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, I started kind of realizing a number of things that were wrong with the development industry. And I'm happy to talk about this later, but essentially I decided to go to grad school to kind of test out some of these theories that I had and kind of how to, kind of sustainably grow these developing countries in Africa. And so in graduate school, so I ended up doing a joint degree at the Kennedy School and the Business School at Harvard. At the Kennedy School, I did a degree called an MPA-ID. It's a Master's in Public Administration and International Development. And the idea is you do kind of two-year master's degrees in 3 years. So I basically spent a year and a half at each school. And so I actually just graduated from that program now, I guess 3 years ago. So I graduated in 2018. And basically throughout my 3 years in graduate school, and can talk more about, kind of my main learnings from that time later. But essentially, I had 3 years, 2 summers to really hypothesize, test all the different career trajectories I was potentially interested in and different countries I was interested in, and just kind of really got to think about different market failures in the developing world from both kind of the public policy angle, which is what I did at the Kennedy School, and then also kind of putting on my business hat on. So kind of thinking about, these market failures from the private sector perspective at Harvard Business School. And so long story short, I had an amazing 3 years, absolutely loved my time in graduate school. And then I ended up where I am right now, which is an organization called the International Finance Corporation. So IFC is actually the part of the larger World Bank group that specializes in private sector development. So essentially our development mandate is very much, kind of same as the World Bank group, eliminating poverty, helping, grow prosperity, but kind of with the private sector hat on. So my role right now is essentially to facilitate private investment into where I am actually, so in East Africa. So I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya right now. Most of my work is in the region. And essentially I'm getting to do what I really love to do. I love living out here. And despite COVID, I actually think, things feel a little bit more normal here than in other parts of the world. So anyways, long story, I will stop there.
Hi everyone, my name is Yuki. I am also a Pomona graduate, class of 2016. I've basically been following in Nanako's footsteps since high school. But so in Pomona, I majored in international relations, and right after graduating from Pomona, I also took up a job in consulting at Deloitte in Tokyo, Japan. I did that for about 2 years before I moved on to a fellowship with a small research center in Washington, D.C., where I was doing sort of East Asian foreign policy type stuff. And I can talk more about the reasons why I decided to sort of make that transition later on. But basically, yeah, I did that for another year. And then after that, I decided it was a good time to go to graduate school and ended up somehow miraculously also at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I currently am now. Yeah, I think mostly I'm still in my second year at the Kennedy School, so I don't really know what I'm doing after school yet. Hopefully I will within the next couple of months. But yeah, that was a super short introduction. Sorry, I feel like I cut out too much of it, but happy to answer any further questions as I go along as well.
Okay. The many questions that I receive from a current student is, how do I decide what industry or field or companies to get into? Just like, how do I decide on a major? How do I decide on a career path based on my skill level, based on my interest, based on other circumstances? In your case, how did you end up, both of you, in the consulting field?
Okay. So for me, it was actually a very practical decision. So as many of you might also be experiencing, if you're on an F1 visa in the US and you want to stay in the US with an H1B, obviously the types of jobs are quite limited. The industries that will actually sponsor these visas are very limited. And so I think having done kind of middle school, high school in Japan, and then when I arrived at Pomona, I had kind of already set my mind from freshman year that I definitely wanted to stay in the US after graduation. And so I felt like my entire 4 years was kind of just like a struggle to figure out how to best do that and execute the strategy that I'd laid out for myself. And so essentially kind of from very early on, I had spoken to a bunch of international students, people, seniors when I was a freshman, to really understand like what needs to happen, how do I do this? And essentially the main advice I got was study economics, because the only two industries that really hire and sponsor H1Bs is mostly in financial services or management consulting. And I had done a finance internship my junior year, didn't really enjoy it, kind of knew that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So I kind of was like, okay, really the only possible path for me in the US is to go into management consulting. And then the natural, kind of thought process beyond that is, well, like I should study economics because that's like the most applicable thing in a liberal arts setting. And so that's actually how I ended up doing economics. Obviously, after, I started my major and kind of doing the coursework, I like fell in love with it, loved kind of thinking with like the economic, framework, like kind of applying that framework onto various problems I saw in the world. And so, at the end, I really enjoyed it. But yeah, for me, it was very much like pragmatic. How can I stay in the US? And then kind of did economics and as an extension, kind of consulting. So.
How about you, Yuki?
Yeah, so I think I was actually pretty lucky in the sense that I had a really good idea of what I wanted to do out of, I guess, college. And that was a lot due to my internship, my summer internship between junior and senior year. So that summer I interned with Starbucks Japan, and I was sort of working with their sort of, what is it called? The supply chain management department on a CSR project, basically working on sort of modifying their ethical sourcing standards for some of their products. And so as an international relations major at that time, who was kind of frustrated with the way that international negotiations about a lot of like public policy issues, including climate change and other like global scale problems, were kind of deadlocked. This concept that businesses could be doing something good for the world was really motivating for me. And so that sort of inspired me to try and carve out a career that focused on how to get businesses to do good for the world. And so that's sort of kind of what's driven me to this point today. But specifically, so right after graduation, I took a very different approach to the visa issue. I was like, well, if I have such a narrow chance of getting an H-1B anyways, I might as well start my career back in Japan, which is basically what I did. So I started looking at options in Japan through the Boston Career Forum, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. And I ended up settling on consulting because, I mean, as a graduate fresh out of college, you don't really know what you're getting into for your first job, and it seemed like they had a lot of emphasis on sort of like building you up as someone who knows their way around in the business world and like giving you the basic skills and knowledge needed for that. And then I also thought it was a good way to get exposure to the business world that I didn't really have an understanding of yet, but I was starting to gain an interest in. And specifically, the company that I chose happened to be developing a sort of service area focused on sort of what's called shared value, which is similar to corporate social responsibility. Can talk about this more later because that's what I'm studying now. But yeah, so I figured it was a good fit. I was lucky enough to land a job there. So that's how I ended up choosing my first job out of college.
Okay, you both went to Pomona. How did Pomona help you in making those decisions? I recall, Nanako, you were involved in or took advantage of a lot of like mentorships of the alumni network. And can you share those experiences?
Yeah, and sorry, when you say the process, you're talking about just general career development process.
Yes.
Of how Pomona helped you. Okay. Let's see. How did Pomona help me? Well, first, I would also like to preface this by saying that we only have one undergraduate experience, and of course, Yuki and I are biased. And then I think having also like spent time at the Kennedy School and at like kind of Harvard in general, which of course is in a graduate school setting, is a little bit different. You kind of like, I was involved with some of the undergrad, like I was a kind of an advisor to some undergrad houses and when I was at the Kennedy School. So like kind of have a sense of what, other maybe larger university undergrad experiences are like. But so let me just preface that with that. But I would say, I think first and foremost, Pomona, I think my main takeaway from graduate school was that I had an amazing time, but professors are so difficult to get a hold of, and mostly because these are very famous people, top experts in their fields, constantly traveling for conferences and other trips. And I remember when my first week in grad school, I was like, oh, I should go to this professor's office hours. Oh, this person only has 1 hour per week available for like 300 students. And so I would like have to like get up really early to like put my name on a sign-up sheet that was on the door. And then I wouldn't necessarily get a slot. And then because these people are so busy, it's like kind of chop, chop, chop. Like you go in, you do your business, then you come out, just have a quick chat and then come out. But I think the amazing thing about Pomona was that professors are just always there. And this is just the product of, like being a small liberal arts college. Professors are often like living on campus or literally right next door. And it's just kind of like an open door policy. So I think just being in an environment for 4 years, like an all residential campus where people are like, whether it's professors or even like deans, like any like adult figure at Pomona, I felt like was always available. And I think because of that, there's this amazing community that's created out of that. And you like really learn to like care for other people. Like you learn how to like build effective communities. And that was something that I felt like was really important when you're in your, when you start college, when you're 18, because obviously that's like a core developmental stage. So I think kind of having had that experience, I just felt like whether it was like my Pomona network or like alumni through Pomona, like I did a lot of like cold emailing, like LinkedIn stalking, etc. But when I was like starting to apply for consulting jobs when I was at Pomona, like all these kind of resources came very handy. And the career development office at Pomona isn't the strongest, I would say, although mind you, I graduated 10 years ago. I think there's been a lot of investment since then. So I keep getting emails about how all these career development resources have changed. But in general, I just felt like people were always there to like listen to me and like hear me out. And I think often it was just like articulating that thought process of like what I wanted to do. like what was my overall, goal and mission in life. Like, I think those were the things that really helped me think thoughtfully about like how I wanted to, spend my time after Pomona. So very kind of, nebulous answer perhaps, but I would say that's probably the most important thing that I can think of.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Nanako and what she said about professors being super available. They really take you under your wing at Pomona. And I think, just to like add a specific anecdote to that sort of sentiment, the internship between my sophomore and junior year, I actually got it through a professor from a contact they knew. And so like I had already like worked with this professor as a research assistant, like taken some of his classes. So like it's not like super random or anything, but like especially like once you have a chance to develop like a very like tight-knit relationship with your professors, like they are also like willing and available to support you and connect you to their contacts and to help you in whatever way they can. And that's something I really appreciated about Pomona and like how small the community is. And then I guess another I guess nebulous sort of answer to the question is I think Pomona has a culture of being very like mission driven and like always constantly asking like, what do you want to do, like what drives you, like what do you want to change about the world sort of atmosphere. At least that's how I perceived it to be. And like I think it's partly because they encourage you to really think about like when you're choosing your major, for example, to like make sure that that's something you're really interested in. And like yeah, like, and there's a very strong culture of like doing something because you are really interested in it and want to make a change in that space. And then so I think that's sort of something that helped me, that I've carried on. Like I can't really speak to specific moments where this kind of thinking has like come in handy necessarily, but I think it's been like a sort of guiding principle since graduation that sort of has helped me get to the point where I am today. Like I think a huge part of the reason why I'm at the Kennedy School and like at a public policy school and not just a MBA degree or like just a, I don't know where else I might be, but like I think part of it is because of that sort of like mission driven spirit that I picked up during my time at Pomona.
Can you talk about networking and the value of networking through your school or through other means? How did that help you in identifying new opportunities, identifying new companies, different ways to approach different, I guess, problems? Can you talk about networking?
Yeah, so I found it very helpful. I think there is so much benefit to stalking people on LinkedIn and browsing through alumni directories, and just like cold emailing people, because there's no loss in doing that, right? You email someone, they're like doing exactly what you want to be doing, or they're doing something that you're interested in trying out. And if they respond, great. And if not, like, like whatever, right? You just kind of move on and you talk to the next person. So yeah, I mean, I definitely would say like I did a lot of that my senior year in college. Or like before I started doing a lot of the consulting internships, I like emailed a bunch of alums, like maybe like a third of them responded. I had a bunch of phone calls. And if anything, I think the preparation there was like more practical, which is, they were just giving me like a lot of advice on like interviewing, and like even it was almost like they would all sometimes, like some alumni offered to do like mock interviews. So I would do like mock interview over the phone. And it's like that kind of practice that I think was really helpful in getting my first job. And then, kind of course, my graduate school network is huge, between two programs and like two huge schools. Like I have like so many people I can contact. And for sure, like when I was looking for internships in graduate school, even my current job at IFC, like I talked to so many alumni. And I felt like I like a dedicated time like every week to make sure that I actually did that. But I think that kind of stuff pays off for sure. And you end up, it's not necessarily about like hearing about, like what the interview is going to be like, and like what should I say, and like what are all the things that will make me look good. It's more just also like hearing about actual lived experiences of alumni who like are actually doing the stuff that you want to do. and then realizing like, oh, that's actually like a good fit, or no, like that's not really what I want to do. And you can also tell a lot about a culture of an organization, right, just by talking to people. So I think not being in an interview setting and being able to talk very frankly about an alumni's experience in X industry, X sector, X organization, like those are things that are like, that's really invaluable information that you just can't get over like browsing the internet or like interviewing. So for me, it's been like incredibly important to network.
Yuki?
I am I think there are a lot of people, especially out of college, who don't like who don't like networking. I am one of those people who never had the knack for networking. I would sometimes talk to alumni, but I could never really figure out how to maintain that like sort of like mentor relationship with them. And I just want to say like, yeah, like networking is great, but it's also okay if you're not that like savvy in the networking skills. That being said, even if you're not, like obviously like there are so many perks in networking. If that's something you're like good at and like are comfortable with, totally go for it. But even if not, like I think there are other ways that don't seem so like, you know, like go into like a meeting room and just network with alumni kind of thing. Like there are also other, I'm trying to think of a good way to say this, networks that you carry on. So for example, right now, like even now, like a lot of the people that I stay in contact with from Pomona are people who were either close friends from close friends from like mentor programs I was a part of, or close friends from my international relations sort of degree group. I forget what it's called, but like there's a group of students who all major in the same thing, right? And I keep in touch with them, and like I've not necessarily like found jobs or opportunities through them, but like it's still very interesting to see what all these people are doing now. Some of them are at grad school around the same time as I am, and it's always like good to know like how our experiences are different across different like school programs. And then also like even like if they're not necessarily like, you know, like even if it's not like directly useful to you, as in like it doesn't bring you opportunities, I feel like these connections that I formed from my time at Pomona are valuable in terms of like sort of like keeping up to date on like what's going on in like related but like not necessarily your areas of expertise around the world. And like in the future, I'm sure like, yeah, they're just going to be great contacts. And like I feel like just like I think don't underestimate the power that your connections that you might not perceive as networks yet could have in the future, I think is what I'm trying to get at. Hope that makes sense.
Well, Yuki,
can I just add one more thing?
Go ahead.
Sorry. If you do, of course it's okay if you don't like networking. Totally understand that feeling. I also personally don't like networking. I mean, it's just something you kind of have to force your, like brute force you have to deal with. But I would say one thing I actually, especially if you're as a Japanese person, you generally feel bad about a lot of things. And I always felt bad about reaching out to alumni and kind of taking up their time. So I was like, oh, these people are so important. I'm wasting their time. Like they're so busy, et cetera, et cetera. But then now that I'm where I am now, like I get so many inbound requests from Pomona students, you know, grad people, and you just like you pay it forward, right? Like every week I dedicate, you know, like every month I dedicate like a few hours to like talking to people about, you know, development and IFC and joint degree and et cetera, consulting. So like that's how I've justified it. So like don't feel bad about reaching out to people because you can always pay that forward when you're older and more developed in your career.
Yeah, that's true. I do also get requests from like current students and also like Grew students who like want to chat with me and what I've done, and I always really love talking to them. So this is a very good point.
Well, Yuki, I think you hinted that I wanted to ask you that you were not happy in the first job, and you know you weren't since you brought it up, I wanted to ask you, what was your thinking? You weren't really happy with the first environment and you wanted to transition out of that. Can you share some of the experiences?
Yeah, I think I'm going to preface this by saying that like now, so it's been 2-3 years since I left the job, and like looking back, there are so many things that I learned even during my short time there that like I am deeply grateful for. But I think at the time I was a bit frustrated with the I'm trying to figure out. I am still grateful, and I really like my, like, in retrospect, I really like my first job. So I'm trying to figure out a good way to say this so that I'm not like completely dragging my experience there. But I think the biggest frustration that I had was the kind of like difficulty. So I think I mentioned earlier that like one of my reasons for wanting to go to Deloitte was because they were rolling out a service line for shared value and like social impact. And like there was a lot of things that was challenging about this sort of service area, but one of the big things was that basically it wasn't really a field that had gained a lot of traction in Japan yet. So even though Deloitte was rolling it out as a service area, there were not a lot of clients to sort of take them up on that, meaning that there weren't a lot of like job openings within that sector. And so I didn't really see a way to sort of like get myself into that corner by staying within the company, or really even by staying in Japan. If a company like Deloitte can offer the service and can't really get clients, like that means the market for that isn't really there yet in Japan. And so like I think looking out for myself and like for my career development in the long term, like I could have stayed and I could have like tried to like, there were a lot of projects that I enjoyed in other industries, but like I wasn't sure that I necessarily wanted to pivot to those. Like I still wanted to give this sort of like dream that I had a chance. And so I started looking at ways that I could try to pursue this, all of which to me entailed a pivot out of that company. And is also why I ended up back at grad school right now. But I hope that sort of answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Nanako, you've been to, I guess, different job setting, different countries. How do you find these different opportunities? Does the opportunity present itself, or are you seeking an opportunity in Africa for some reason? Can you share those things?
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, I think over the multiple jobs I've had in my career, like there's some like big learning that I get from each job, and it's usually there's some source of dissatisfaction that makes me leave that job, and I'm like, I want this in my next job. And so I guess to give like actual examples of this, so like when I was at Oliver Wyman, I was like, this work is not particularly exciting. Like in terms of first job out of school, like consulting is amazing, gives you so many skills. Like the amount of resources invested in you to like train you into like a very good working professional is amazing. Totally took that for granted. But I think I was like, okay, I want something that has like actual tangible impact on the world, where I feel like I'm actually doing a quote unquote good. And so I think when I was at Oliver Wyman, I actually started utilizing my like consulting network, so like the alumni within Oliver Wyman. So again, like doing networking within that group. And then kind of came across multiple organizations that essentially like hired a bunch of ex-consultants to like basically use business approaches to solving, development challenges in various countries. So I kind of narrowed it down. So like Chai, this organization I was at, was one. There's an organization called TechnoServe, founded by a bunch of McKinsey people. And then like there were like a handful of those. And so it was really like actually talking to Oliver Wyman alumni that I like came across these organizations. It was through Oliver Wyman alumni that I got, a lot of these interviews and ultimately ended up getting a job. at Chai. So it's a combination of like, yeah, like some lesson learned in that previous job, and then like actively using my network to think about, okay, how do I best leverage the skills that I, obtain in that previous job, and then apply to the next job. So then, I went to Chai. When I was at Chai, I think the biggest takeaway for me was I love the world of public health. The HIV tuberculosis world is, it's really like an unfortunate situation, but like the amount of resources going into those two diseases is actually incredible. So like there's incredible work that's being done in all these countries. I think my main takeaway for that was so many especially African countries are so dependent on foreign aid. Like for example, in Malawi, where I was working, like basically like 90% of their health system is funded by donors. And so I was like, how is this sustainable? Like if something like, for example, global financial crisis happened in 2009, like that year, if you kind of look at funding levels for HIV, like it just like plummets, right? And so obviously that really affects the programming on the ground in these countries. And so, yeah, I was like, love this work, but like ultimately I want to be working in an organization where like my impact is sustainable, where ultimately like I can leave, like there's a lot much more focus on capacity building on the ground. And when, time is up for me to leave, like the work can still continue, right? So that was kind of my main focus. And so basically I went to grad school to like think about, okay, so how do I help countries shift to more sustainable health systems? So that was like really my incoming question. And so like most of my coursework was like, basically in grad school, if you do go to grad school, this is my main suggestion, which is go in with like a bunch of questions you want to test, whether it's through classes, talking to people, internships, etc. Grad school is just like an amazing ground to just like hypothesize, test everything, right? Like everything you've ever wanted to question, especially if you're at a school like Harvard, there's so many resources for everything, and anyone you want to talk to is always there. And so in grad school, so basically my first summer I ended up working at a development agency in Rwanda called the Rwanda Development Board. So their main mandate is to facilitate private investment into the country. So that was my 1 year after at the Kennedy School, where I very much kind of spent the first year like putting on my public policy hat. And I was like, okay, I want to work in government and think about like how to sustainably bring in private investment, specifically into healthcare. So then I like did that internship, really liked it. But then again, like my main takeaway for that was like, well, like I'm not Rwandan, like I'm not from these countries, like me working in government is like very bizarre, right? Like I shouldn't be there. It should be locals actually working there. And so then my second summer, which was the year after I did my HBS year, Harvard Business School year, my focus was, okay, so like I'm really into this like facilitating private investment into these countries and like helping basically create the private sector, right? Because ultimately how you need countries to become sustainable is where they have like an actual private sector and a tax base where like governments can actually pay for their own public services, like for like healthcare, for example. And so that was kind of like my shift in focus and like my second year. And then after I spent my year in business school, I was like, okay, I want to kind of be on like the other side of this experience that I had in Rwanda. So like, I want to be in the private sector, like actually be on the investing side and like figure out like what are all the like business challenge and like, things that I need to think about being a private investor, investing in these countries, and also often working very closely with government. And so then I went to Ethiopia, where I worked with a private equity fund, which is fascinating, learned so much. And then basically it was like those two experiences where ultimately I was like, okay, all this is really interesting, but ultimately my big takeaway in Ethiopia was that PE is interesting, except there wasn't much of like a development mandate. So, sure, you have a lot of impact putting money into a very poor country, but like, how do you think about sustainably investing in like environment, like all the environmental challenges and social challenges, and like what are the repercussions of these investments into these countries, right? And so then that's how I like started scouring around and figuring out what I wanted to do. And then through alumni, friends, etc., I was like, okay, basically I was like, I want to go work at an international organization that like is only focused on the private sector, basically. And the IFC specifically, so I'm currently in a program called the Young Professionals Program. So it's kind of like a entry-level rotational program that targets MBAs, master's students, PhDs, etc. So I was like, I really want to get into this program because then I can essentially like rotate through the institution, rotate through different geographies, and then like kind of like figure out exactly where my place is in IFC. So that's, yeah, I mean, they basically recruited at Harvard. So I, interviewed for that and then, thankfully got it. So yeah, so that was kind of my like trajectory. But I would say basically it's like always something that it's between like learnings and talking to different people, and then just thinking about like what ultimately makes me happy and satisfied in my job, that like I just like always think about the next step. So
Okay. Couple couple questions. Looking back, do you have any specific advice to your current undergrad students in deciding what career path they should take? One or two or three? I will ask you, Yuki, you can start, since, you know, Nanaka always the first one to answer questions.
Yeah, I think the first big piece of advice is like the internships, like your summer internships, like between your like sophomore, junior, and senior years, are a really great opportunity to sort of figure out what you want to do and like what sort of work you like doing. I know a lot of I know it's really easy to sort of get caught up into the sort of, if you want to go into finance, like you have to have done a finance like internship in the summer previous, or the same goes for consulting. But like, I think it's fine if you, even if you don't like follow that grind necessarily. I think it, in the long term, like I think it's going to be more helpful to sort of pursue a variety of different things during your internship, so like you can figure out, like maybe you'll do a finance internship and like end up hating it and like decide not to go after you graduate anyways. Like I think of it more as like an experimental base for figuring out what you want to do. And then also in looking for a job right after graduation, like I was pretty dead set on consulting. I only applied to consulting firms, but and like I would have been really bummed if I hadn't gotten into any. But I think like in retrospect, like even the job that you think you really want like isn't necessarily going to be what you want to continue doing like 3 to 5 years down the road. So like don't really tie your like future and your like identity too much to a particular job, and like just have good faith in yourself and in your future to sort of like figure out what it is that you are best suited for and like what you want to do, and just like keep your options open. Like I think the one thing that was great about consulting is that it doesn't tie you down to a specific industry. So like I don't know, but like I imagine that like if you come from like an investment banking background, it's much harder to pivot into a different sort of career. Like if you were like, I think it would be a bigger challenge to pivot from like finance, investment banking to like, I don't know, international development than it would from like consulting to something, just because consulting is pretty widespread. So I think I was really lucky in that sense. I was able to keep my future options open. Yeah, like I think don't get too tied down to one specific career goal, and like also always a good thing to have multiple options open in the future, I think.
Okay, Nanako.
Yeah, let's see. In terms of advice, I mean, it's kind of similar to what Yuki said, but I think it's okay to not know what you want to do. That's normal. Like, especially coming out of liberal arts school, like how could you possibly know what you want to do, right? Like you learn anything and everything, and it's like such a broad curriculum, and like you're actually interested in everything. But then there are like real practical constraints, right? Like if you want to stay in the US, you have to think about visa things. You know, if you go to Japan, like you have to think about like how do I recruit for jobs when I'm in the US for Japan. Obviously there are things like the Boston Career Forum, but like obviously that's like another practical consideration. So it's okay that you don't know what to do, but at the same time, I do think, you know, like think a lot, especially in your senior year, I guess starting in a junior actually, because a lot of the recruiting stuff happens way before then, but like really think about like what brings you joy, right? Like what news excites you, you know, like what are you always like Googling or like find yourself in conversations with in the dining halls, like whatever it is, like those are all things that are like, it's good data for you to like understand like what could I possibly start my career in, right? So I think pay attention to those things, and then the other thing I would recommend is, if you think you want to do graduate school, I'd really encourage you to do like at least ideally two jobs, maybe even more. Of course, this is different if you like want to do a PhD because that's very specific. But actually, even like something like law school too, like I think the more you work before graduate school, the more you'll get out of it. Because at the end of the day, grad school, I mean, it's an amazing academic environment, but like people bring their real life experience into the classroom, right? So like in terms of learning from other classmates, like I learned the most from people who had like, 8-10 years of experience, obviously like, above the average age for that program, but learned a lot. And then, for me too, like being able to speak very specifically about like healthcare challenges in Africa, et cetera, whatever. Like those were things that I felt like I could really contribute to and like felt good doing that. And that would often just like spark conversations with other classmates. So yeah, I would definitely say that, just kind of, explore different things ideally. And then you might even realize like, oh, grad school isn't for me, right? Like some people are dead set on grad school right after undergrad. And it's like, well, you have no idea. Maybe you want to do international development, but then you like go work in some developing country, your second job, and you absolutely hate it, right? That's like easy process of elimination. It's like, all right, well, I'm not going to spend like 50K per year on some master's degree that I obviously am not even interested in. So yeah, just like try out as many different things as possible and then realize like you want to go to grad school or like do something else. And then also the other thing that I found really helpful was, again, if you do want to go to grad school, often every grad school has like student profiles on their website. So like I also have one like on Harvard Business School's website, and like people contact me through that because they, whatever, resonate with my story or whatever. But I read a ton of those, and it's just really interesting because like you can look at someone's LinkedIn profile and they're like, okay, they did this job, this job, this job. This is kind of what I want to do, but you don't really understand their motivations behind doing certain things and like how they made the transition, why they made the transition. And so often like schools have profiles and like there are like actual narratives on like why people took certain paths. And I found that really interesting. And I like actually started reading those like in my first job. And that was like kind of inspiration to think about like, oh, I should go work in public health, or oh, I should go, do a master's degree in development economics, et cetera. So yeah, in this day and age, like, everything you can Google and everything is available online. So like definitely just like do your research, read everything, talk to people. Yeah, that would probably be my main advice.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Well, I had one last question. In your career search, or actually doing the work in a national organization, as being a Japanese, is that an asset or is irrelevant, or did you take advantage of that being a Japanese person? Because from my experience years ago, that was definitely an advantage, because many organizations, American international organizations, they had some issues dealing with the Japanese market. They wanted to attract more Japanese capital. They wanted to solve issues with their partners in Japan. So they were always looking for Japanese talent. Do you find that to be the case?
Do you want to take it? I'm happy to go first if you
want. I don't know that I necessarily have the context to quite answer that question. I will say like going way back into college years, like being from Japan and having that like language advantage was really useful initially in like getting to know professors, and also like landing certain like research assistant jobs that required like knowledge about Japan or just general like Japanese language skills. That eventually paid off really later on when I decided to become an IR major, and like sort of like having that like slight edge in like East Asian foreign policy like was really sort of helpful in like carving out a niche for myself in the IR space. But beyond that, honestly, since I think like since graduating from Pomona, I mean, like first off, my first job was in Japan, so like that's just default, like everyone is Japanese for the most part, not everyone, but like a good majority is. And then I think at HKS, there are so many people from everywhere around the world. It's like Japan is just one country among many. And I think it might be different if you're like looking to go into like international development perhaps, or like other sort of like spaces where like government, like ODA and like other like international, like I don't really know what the word for it is, that kind of stuff matters. But I think just my area where I am right now, because it's so private sector focused, there's less emphasis on like specific countries, because most of my work right now is focused on multinationals, if that makes sense. Sorry, like this is all a long-winded say to say, yes, it was useful for me in college. I don't know that I can point to any specific circumstances right now.
Okay. How about you, Nanako?
I would say it's not particularly been helpful. Maybe actually my current job is probably like the first job I've ever had where I've like have, you know, Japanese colleagues and talk in Japanese, and within the World Bank Group, you know, like the World Bank Group comprises of various country shareholders, and like Japan is the second biggest donor to the World Bank Group. So there's like a fairly large presence in Japan. I'm asked to participate in things in the office. So interestingly, like I guess it's kind of beneficial in my current job, but not really. I mean, I think what Adachi-san said is interesting, because the era of like Japan ruling the world economically is like obviously like not the case anymore. And if anything, like I kind of wish I spoke Chinese, Mandarin specifically. I wish I, you know, I don't know, like knew more languages actually, to especially where I work, where like, you know, like I'm prohibited from working in West Africa because I don't speak French, or, you know, like working like Portuguese colonies, I don't speak Portuguese. I mean, obviously, you know, depends on your profession and the type of organization you're in, but in my experience, like at least my day-to-day work, obviously I don't really use Japanese. So, but I think maybe the one thing, this is like not so practical from like a language perspective, and more just like culturally, like how you're attuned to like your personality traits, or whatever. I think generally Japanese people are very good at reading the room, kuki o yomu. And I think that is absolutely critical in an environment where you're working with so many people from various different cultures, like especially at a place like the IFC, like every single nationality is represented in my organization. Like I remember my first week on the job, I like had a notebook and I actually was like writing down every single country that people said they were from. Like I had all these orientation sessions, and like there were people that I like never knew, like I never knew anyone from Madagascar, or like never knew anyone from Benin, or like, you know, very random like things like that. And I think because it's such a multicultural environment, it is so important for you to like actually like read the room and like understand where people are coming from, and know that like their culture, real cultural differences. And if anything, like a lot of, for example, Kenyan culture, I feel is like the perfect in between like Japanese culture and American culture in terms of like communication style and like humor even. So I think it's things like that that are actually like really good things, like things that I think I feel lucky to be Japanese for, and like can definitely like see it being a practical use in my day-to-day. So
Well, thank you very much. I think our time is up, and I really appreciate your willingness to share your experience. Be safe, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you.
great, thank you.